This futuristic dress that I am wearing right now is actually a vintage garment made in 1967 that was inspired by a garment from the Middle Ages. How do I know? I've already made a video explaining all the different reasons why I know that this dress is from the year 1967. In that video, I explained how this dress was directly inspired by two high-fashion dresses designed by this man, and that his designs were largely inspired by futurism. Now, you might be asking, what does that have to do with the Middle Ages? Why would a designer who's trying to design dresses from the future design a garment that is inspired by the Middle Ages, and how exactly is it inspired by the Middle Ages? Well, to explain that, I'm going to have to backtrack a bit. Well, a lot. All the way back to the 1300s, to be exact. For starters, it should be noted that the dress that I am wearing right now is a pinafore-style dress, and it could be argued that all pinafore-style garments are direct descendants of a medieval garment called the cyclis, or the surcoat. Cyclis was the earlier term used, and it was used for the earlier, more looser fitting styles that generally provided more coverage, but there was a period where the terms cyclis and surcoat were kind of used interchangeably, so they're basically the same thing. A cyclis or surcoat was worn over a kirtle, which was a long one-piece dress-style garment worn by both women and men. But I believe that the inspiration for this 1960s dress was a bit more direct than just being a pinafore, therefore related to the surcoat, because, for one thing, it seems to have been inspired by a particular style of surcoat, typically worn more by women. Later styles of the surcoat were always open from the shoulder to the hip, but some styles worn by women could be cut so deeply on the sides that the cutouts could be seen around the front, such as in this illustration here. And this illustration here, that gives us a view of the cutouts from the back. A 21st century recreation of a surcoat. Fashion historians and medieval clothing enthusiasts will often refer to these more open styles as cutaway surcoats. Now back to, or perhaps I should say forward to, the 1960s. I am 99% sure that this man designed this dress inspired by medieval surcoats. Also, he often paired these surcoat-like pinafores with opaque tights, which were reminiscent of men's tights from the Middle Ages. Further supports that his historical inspiration was medieval in origin. Now, why do I think that he did that? Why would a futurist fashion designer design a medieval-inspired dress? Just think about it. Fashion is always inspired by the past because inspiration has to come from somewhere. Art does not come from a vacuum. A lot of 60s mod fashion was inspired by the 1920s, and the inspiration was very direct in ways that some people often don't even think about. One example is the Mondrian collection by Yves Saint Laurent. It was inspired by a whole bunch of paintings that were done by Piet Mondrian in the 1920s. Not to mention the silhouettes of the dress themselves had a straight, boxy 20s feel. So much of the mod look was inspired by the 20s and Art Deco. He was trying to imagine what people would be wearing in the distant future, but it would be a bit self-aggrandizing as a fashion designer living in the 20th century himself to assume that they would be using 20th century fashion design as their inspiration in the distant future. Had so many previous centuries of design and art to pick from. And garments inspired by ancient history was far from a novel idea. There were already garments made before the 1960s that were inspired by things like Greco-Roman togas and stuff like that. He solved the historical inspiration problem by going really far back. That's my theory anyway. From now until Christmas Day, I will be sharing outfits from the 1960s that are inspired by the Middle Ages. This is technically the first one. However, all of the other garments that I'm going to be sharing will be garments that were influenced by the late 1960s historical romanticism fad. Their medieval inspiration is trying to look old-fashioned and fantasy-like. The medieval inspiration is trying to be more overt, whereas the medieval inspiration here was not trying to be visible. I thought it would be a perfect bridge between the futurism of the 60s and the romanticism of the 60s and illustrate how they kind of coexisted together in ways that you wouldn't think they would be able to.